It's the end of the 5th episode of Dispatch, and the Z-Team is hitting its stride. After successfully handling a citywide blackout, the rehabilitated villains decide to go out for drinks. But this time is different. For the first time, Robert Robertson actually accepts their invitation to join them. Unfortunately for him, he ends the night concussed after a bar fight at the Sardine. But on the bright side, the Z-Team is closer than ever, endangering themselves to protect each other without hesitation. So, as everyone regroups with late-night tacos, the Z-Team asks you an important question. Who are you really, Robert? Well, if you made it this far, there's roughly an 80% chance you chose this option. I'm Mecha Man. And if you did, I can't really blame you because I chose it too. Within the context of the episode, it just feels right. The Z-Team had been pestering Robert about it for a while, and Invisigal just told him his secrecy makes him look like a narc. After everyone had each other's backs in a villain brawl, not telling them just feels like a cop-out. But what if I told you that this was actually the worst option? What if I told you the seemingly cowardly answer of I'm Robert is actually the perfect culmination of Robert's character arc and Dispatch's larger themes? That would be a pretty bold claim, right? Well, I'll explain. But to do that, we have to start at the beginning. And by that, I mean the very beginning. From the very first scene, we're thrown right into the larger themes of the game. Robert's first line is that he obviously loves his dad, before the sympathetic speaker calls him out for that phrasing. And after doing so, you are presented with your first set of dialogue options that show that Robert wasn't that close to him. After selecting one of them, we find out that this was a misdirection, and the conversation wasn't happening with a therapist or close friend. Instead, the person Robert confided in was a villain named Toxic, and Robert actually has him tied up for interrogation purposes in what appears to be a mostly abandoned, barren room. This short scene alone already crams in layers of characterization for Robert, but let's fast forward a bit before getting into it further. After a one-man raid on Shroud's warehouse goes wrong, we learn through a news broadcast that Robert is a third-generation Mecha Man. The news anchor states the previous generations of Mecha Man gave everything, including their lives to protect Los Angeles. We then transition to Robert giving an interview where he says the same thing. He gave everything to the people of Los Angeles. He later gets drinks with Blonde Blazer, who uses similar phrasing to ask why he chose to be a hero. But the answers aren't super satisfying. He can give a boilerplate I like helping people answer, reply he's not sure, or how he thought it was the only thing he's good at. Now, considering moments ago Robert just stated in a press conference that being Mecha Man was his biggest honor, these answers feel off. They don't read like someone that's motivated by a passion for heroism. Instead, they read like an inevitability he's resigned to. And yet, shortly before, Robert mentions he kept the suit repaired by burning through his inheritance. So, something isn't quite adding up here. Anyways, Robert later returns home for the first time since his coma, and it's revealed that the interrogation room from the opening scene was actually his apartment. It just has nothing to it, closer resembling a self-storage unit than a living space. The episode then concludes with Robert and Beef drifting off to sleep together. Alright, so that was a lot of plot summary, but it was important to review since episode 1 masterfully lays the groundwork for the entire rest of the game. So let's unpack it. The big takeaway is that Mecha Man has a legacy of giving everything to protect the people of Los Angeles, and Robert is the third-generation Mecha Man. What we see early on is exactly what that entails. In Robert's case, it quite literally means everything. His room is nearly completely devoid of any personal touches. He has depressingly bare walls, no everyday material possessions, or even any keepsakes on display. Robert also doesn't seem to have any sense of community or support network. His only opportunity to open up about his complicated relationship with his father wasn't to a friend, but instead, a villain he captured. So all in all, Robert's dialogue and behavior show that the years of devoting himself to being a hero have taken their toll, and Robert's apartment is a symbolic representation of this imbalance. His first visitor being a villain demonstrates how his work has overtaken his personal life. There's no furniture, light, or other signs that suggest a human occupies a space. The only decor that breaks up the glorified storage pod is a detective board of Shroud's operations and the ruined Mecha Man suit ominously looming over him. So, in short, Robert's apartment reflects that there actually is no Robert. There is only Mecha Man. However, there is a single source of warm light in the room, one that instills hope at Robert's lowest point. That is the glow from Robert's phone as he watches a video of Blonde Blazer giving a press conference about the work at the Superhero Dispatch Network. With a simple visual, the message is clear. SDN is Robert's future. So the next day, Robert starts his new life, joining the Phoenix program, a program meant to rehabilitate villains. The team is a complete disaster, as one would expect from a group of former bad guys. But after his first shift, Robert realizes he knows how to get through to them. He just needs to give them tough love, which he mentions is the only kind of love he knows. So after the weekend, Royd helps him move the Mecha Man suit from his apartment, commenting on how it makes him sad just looking at it. Then Robert heads to his second shift. Unfortunately, it goes catastrophically, as the Z team repeatedly sabotages one another to avoid getting let go. Left with no other options, Robert unveils that he actually had a superpower hidden the whole time, the ability to always bullshit the perfect response. He tells the team that many people see them as deadbeat, run-of-the-mill villains, but he sees their potential. He spells out that every member is a phoenix and are meant to burn up their old selves to become who they are meant to be. What he doesn't realize at the time is that this also applies to himself. Like I said earlier, Robert is a third-generation Mecha Man, but he's also a third-generation Robert. Now, it's no coincidence that Robert shares his name with two other generations. Sharing that name implies he's the natural continuation of the Robertsons, and thus of the Mecha Man dynasty. So, from his very birth, Robert was always told who he was expected to be. That's why his decision to become Mecha Man is treated like a foregone conclusion. Robert never had the opportunity to decide who he wanted to be. So, left with no other option and burdened by Mecha Man's importance to the community, Robert felt crushed under the weight of his family's legacy, never getting the opportunity to figure out who he really was. But Robert isn't the only person who feels this sense of pressure. After giving his speech to the Z team, Invisigal runs off. Robert then has a talk with her where she states her powers made her feel like she was destined to be a villain. And later on in the story, if you choose to get dinner with Blonde Blazer, she feels hesitant to show her true self. And though Robert points out that she's still objectively gorgeous, to Mandy, that doesn't matter. She still feels pressured to live up to her magically superpowered form. So, the labels of hero and villain aren't just extremely destructive to Robert, but also the main cast of Dispatch. There's no better example of this than the Z team. As we spend more time with them, we realize that they were all unfairly reduced to their label, often for arbitrary reasons. Most of the team has pretty minor offenses compared to what many would expect from villains in a superhero universe. And the two most chill, level-headed members, Golem and Malevola, were seemingly labeled as such simply for looking the part. Those two at their core are nicer people than Robert's dad, who was known to be kind of a prick. He was a detached and insensitive father to Robert, and his mockery of Shroud turned him into a monstrous supervillain. Yet, the Z team is written off as lost cause villains, while Robbie left behind a legacy as one of Los Angeles' greatest heroes. And the cruel injustice of it all is that because the Z team are written off as villains, that's how they act. The constant dismissal they receive reinforces the idea that they can't accomplish anything, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. So regardless of whether you are labeled a hero or a villain, the titles are destructive to their recipients, reducing them down to a black and white category that doesn't capture their nuances. However, without realizing it, Robert begins to push himself and others to overcome this in episode 3. After inspiring Invisigal to thwart Lightning Struck, Blazer asks Robert whether he actually believes in her, to which he can respond, "I believe anyone can be who they want to be." Of course, there's some irony in this assertion because for a while, Robert can't apply this logic to himself. Even as he works more shifts with the Z team, his apartment remains depressingly empty, and he's still mostly driven by getting his suit back. But in episode 4, we see his mentality begin to shift. He sees a little kid with his parents at SDN, then looks at a picture of him with his dad, finally showing some admission that he desires some meaning in his life beyond being just Mecha Man. And that's when he starts to let the Z team and other people at SDN into his life more. By the beginning of episode 5, even the hot-headed Flambe admits that they need him as Robert, not as the former hero he used to be. So later, after weeks of attrition, Robert finally takes up the Z team's offer to join them for a night out, ready to take that next step towards building friendships with his colleagues. And that brings us up to the moment from the beginning of this video. After months of development, the Z team shows that they're literally willing to fight for each other, and they ask Robert who he really is. And while they clearly meant this in a literal sense, this is the pivotal moment where Robert has to ask himself who he identifies more as, Mecha Man or Robert. If you tell the Mecha Man, you answer the question more directly and show you trust your team, but in the process, Robert avoids being completely honest with himself. He states that this Robert guy is a front and mentions his time at SDN was just a stopgap on his return to being Mecha Man. And in a way, that's sad. It shows Robert is either in denial or doesn't feel like he learned anything from his time at SDN. But if you pick I'm Robert, this is a breakthrough moment for him. Sure, it seems like he's evading the question, but it also gives his new friends more credit. It means that Robert's time with the Z-Team caused him to finally believe his own spiel. It's an admission that he's grown into the best version of himself and that he never would have gotten there without his time at SDN. Before, Robert was just a lonely hero, crushed under the weight of his family legacy. But now, thanks to the Z-Team, Robert has found his true purpose and is comfortable just being him. It's the culmination of all his time at SDN and puts a neat bow on his character arc. That said, regardless of which option you chose, Robert still eventually comes to this realization, but his epiphanic self-acceptance at this moment makes the events that follow much more impactful. About halfway through episode 6, Robert drinks alone in his depressing apartment, musing to beef that for the first time in his life, he can see a life outside of Mecha Man. Then, right on cue, Malevola portals her way through his apartment door, bringing a lamp and commencing an impromptu party at Robert's residence. The Z-Team states that it's a housewarming party since it's the first time Robert is getting furniture and using his apartment to actually live. But this scene is doing more than that. By bringing lamps, the Z-Team is literally giving the house more warmth. The hollow, dark apartment is now filled with furniture and various sources of light, symbolizing how the Z-Team has helped Robert find his true calling and community. For the first time in forever, Robert is not alone, and Robert Robertson is allowed to be a person beyond Mecha Man. And that puts him at odds with what comes next: Shroud. See, while Robert obviously has a personal motive to take Shroud down, given that he, killed his dad, the two were bound to clash regardless, because at this point in the story, they represent opposite ideologies. In episode 7, we finally get to have a direct conversation with Shroud, and he reveals a lot. After capturing Robert, he says this.
Your dad, Chase, your little team of turncoats. You think you can beat the bad by being good, but there's no solving human nature. You can't stop evil. All you can do is control it.
This philosophy is reflected by his superpower. With his neural enhancement, he's able to predict everyone's actions with near-perfect accuracy. So, in essence, his doctrine is that humans have no free will, no agency to take control of their lives. Instead, their best course of action is to accept their destinies imposed upon them. This defeatist mentality parallels Robert's thinking in episode 1, where he acted like becoming Mecha Man was this inevitability. But that was the old Robert. After his time at SDN, Robert realizes that his off-the-cuff speech about being reborn like a phoenix was correct. Whether they're labeled as villains or heroes, people can take control of their lives and change for the better. Robert has a whole team of reformed heroes who can prove it. And if that wasn't proof enough, Robert himself has lived it. So the final battle between Robert and Shroud is more than a blood feud. It's a battle between free will versus determinism. And in this case, the spontaneity from free will is what gives SDN the upper hand. When the Z-Team comes to back Robert up, he snidely remarks that even he can't predict what they're going to do next. And later in the fight, they continue the trend of catching Shroud off guard with their unpredictability. Shroud fails to account for Chase getting Blonde Blazer's powers to save Robert, and during the final showdown, Shroud is ultimately undone by another surprise. Depending on how the story goes, Shroud can either be defeated by Invisigal appearing out of the blue, or by Robert forcing him to take a chance on selecting the correct Astro Pulse. Regardless, the message is clear. There is no scientific formula to predicting human nature. People control their own destinies, and they will always find a way to surpass your expectations, no matter how much you think you have them figured out. That is ultimately what Dispatch is about. At its core, it's an optimistic story that advocates for human empowerment and pushes back against the harmful effects of societal expectations and the self-fulfilling prophecies they create. And while it acknowledges the difficulty of dealing with them, Dispatch rejects the notion that people should roll over and accept them, because the reality is that people are much more complex in their categories. Even people who are written off as lost causes still have the ability to take control of their lives and change for the better. The other important takeaway is that this journey doesn't have to be alone. Surrounding yourself with a community of people who support and believe in you will help you realize your potential. So if there's one lesson to be learned from Dispatch, it's don't settle for doing what is expected of you. Instead, remember you are always in control of your own destiny. Because maybe you're not supposed to be just Mecha Man. Maybe you're supposed to be Robert. For those of you that made it this far, thank you so much for supporting my first non-Borderlands video. I plan on continuing to cover other games besides Borderlands in the future. So if you enjoyed the video, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Otherwise, I'll give you the punch-up special. Anyways, thanks again, bye.